Important second phase of the traffic and transportation. That will be in 2 weeks' time, so we can all look forward to that. And with that, unless there are any comments or questions,
Can I say just one thing?
Yes.
I just want to thank you guys for cleaning up Winthrop Ave. I see, I called about a month ago, and it's continuous now. So thank you very much for picking up the trash and everything. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's loud. I'm looking around for Andrew Townsend, who's our, I don't see, Andrew was here earlier. Okay. We gave him 1 night off. So Andrew Townsend, who's an awesome part of our team, is primarily responsible for those sorts of things. So thank you very much. I appreciate that, Counselor. Thank you. So I'm going to, how's that if I hold the microphone? Okay. So I'm probably going to hand the microphone pretty quickly to Doug. Just a couple of other quick things I would just add to Bob's table setting. First of all, it's an honor to be back with everybody. We are preparing to make our MIPA filing as well on Monday, just to add to that, Bob. So in advance of the next meeting here in about 2 weeks, you will have on paper our plan for transportation improvements along all the different streets in 1A corridor, together with all the other appropriate work in the MIPA filing as well. So you'll have quite a bit of documentation. I think it's 500 pages. How many pages do you think? Yeah. It's a lot. Bob is used to these things, and this is a pretty sizable one. At 500 pages, probably doesn't include the attachments and things, so it's pretty sizable. So you'll have that for 2 weeks before we meet again. But again, the purpose of tonight is to kind of run through the chapters in terms of where we are to date. This is, I think Doug's going to present a little bit, but this is really about people continuing to give us feedback. And I agree with Bob, if we get done early and we can all go home and see our families, that would be awesome too. It might be a surprise for my wife and kids to see me walk through the door. Thank you for that. So with that, let me just introduce Doug, and we'll
Also add, this is not a speak now or forever hold your peace meeting. If you have comments that you want to send in by email, that would be most welcome.
You can send them to us. You can send them to Bob, who will forward them to us, I'm sure. You can send them to our website. There's a variety of different ways you can do it, and you can handwrite something if you want and just give it to us. Whatever you feel like doing, we're totally fine with that. So thank you, Doug.
Thank you. All right. So what we're going to do is just kind of go through just the organization of the submission. I'm going to hold this down a little bit. Is that good? Not okay. So originally we had 7 chapters. We actually have now 8 chapters. We actually broke out municipal impacts. Before, that was actually included in one of the other chapters, so we broke that out so it could be clearer and more understood. But this gives you the sense of these are the 8 chapters. And again, as Bob said, you guys have 5 of them. 3 that are forthcoming are transportation, phasing, and municipal impacts. You're likely going to see Chapter 6 and Chapter 8 pretty quickly, is our hope, and then following on with Chapter 5 as well, too. But so again, this is the structure of it, but again, pretty straightforward. Introduction, Chapter 1, Master Plan Mixture of Uses, Chapter 2, Public Open Space, Roadway Infrastructure Resiliency, Transportation, Phasing, Environmental Municipal Impacts. And again, this is a very long document as well. The MIPA submission covers a lot of these as well too. So the reason why there's a part delay in some of these is that we're literally translating the MIPA section into more of a rare focus section as well too. So as we go through this, but you guys will have actually access to the MIPA document. So you're gonna have a 500-page MIPA document. This is a little slimmer, probably in the 300 to 350 range. So if you guys are bored and need reading material, you're going to have it. But the good news is that it's organized in a way that's pretty straightforward up front. So if you have certain focuses that you want to, you're really interested in, you can really kind of dig into the details.
And in addition to this, there will be a much more concise, perhaps 30-page executive summary.
Correct. And I forgot to put it on the bottom. This is my fault. But yeah, so we also are going to create a 30-page executive summary that's going to have a series of exhibits, which is really geared towards for other community members, for the city council. So it'll be a condensed version of all of this, and it will basically have it'll have very much the same format. So it'll go through all of these, but in a much more condensed way, so that people can really understand it, because there's a lot of detailed information here. So that's just the structure. So I'm going to kind of go chapter by chapter, but when we were with the PRB, we didn't, this is not meant to be rigorous where you can't say something on chapter 2 because we're on chapter 1. It really became an open forum as we started to go through it. But what I wanted to do here was I wanted to put on the bullet points. So we got a lot of great feedback from Bob and the PRB last Wednesday. And so these bullet points are what we're expanding on, right? So again, you guys got a first draft. We usually don't do this, but we really got you an early look draft. And so this is still under involvement. But for example, the comments that we got back on chapter 1, which is introduction overview, we're adding additional details on these areas. So we're going to expand more detail on the benefits and impacts on the neighboring Revere community. This actually exists in all the chapters, but we didn't pull it up as well into the introduction or overview. We're going to expand on the ability for the phasing to be flexible. There wasn't a transportation section yet in chapter 1 because it wasn't written yet, but it's going to get added in. Same thing with traffic mitigation. One thing we do with the MIPA document, we're going to do a better job here too, is really kind of have a community benefits section up front so people can really kind of see here are all the benefits the city of Revere is getting from this. Bob asked us to add a section on jobs and workforce impacts. Again, we have that in the municipal impact section, but we're going to move up some detail there. And then just to help, because again, this is really a Revere-focused permitting document, but just to remind people that there is the 109 acres right next to us in Boston, so that each chapter will have some type of relation back so that people can understand, well, how does this kind of relate to Boston a little bit? And it's not to provide over detail on Boston, because again, the MIPA filing is actually also a joint Boston filing, so there's extensive detail in the MIPA filing on actually what's happening in Boston, but it was just good to make sure that people could actually say, okay, I get what's happening in Revere, how does it kind of connect to Boston? And you guys have seen it. The goal is really to be seamless, right? Literally where you won't know that you're walking over the city boundary between, Revere and Boston or vice versa. That's the ultimate goal. And, but we might have to put some lines just for liability of, which side of the sidewalk you fall on. But the idea is just to make it clear. So I'm going to pause there just to let you know what we're adding in. So I'm going to open it up to questions on this chapter. Ed, no surprise.
I promise to be brief tonight, so that everybody can get one. I do have one question, and it might be worth, at least for me, to make sure that we're all clear when we talk this PUD document and its usage going forward. If I understand beyond us, there's the PUD subcommittee, I think, that's been meeting regularly to develop this document. And then when the document is done, it's going to be submitted to the city council. Is that true?
So
Go ahead.
So I'm going to explain how I think it's working, and then Frank's going to correct me. Okay, so if I screw it up. So a couple things. You guys are seeing preview of all these chapters, and we are meeting both with the DAG as well as the PRB, putting this together. This is then going to come back to the City of Revere as a preliminary application. So full package, and it's called a preliminary application. And the city then has, I believe, 21 days to go through it for completeness. And then they respond back. And the goal is, the reason why we're going through this is because we hope that this is actually complete, for what they're looking for to review. And when we do that, this whole DAG is going to get that full package again, okay? And the goal is that you guys will be able to look at it and say, well, we asked for these things, and great, they're all here. And then at the end of that, Frank may come back with additional comments, or if we're good, then the idea is we submit then what's called the final application, which again is literally the same thing again, and our hope is that by doing this, we've reduced it. From there, then the executive summary comes along with it, and then everything kind of goes to city council as well, too, as that's my understanding. And then so the city council goes through their process, and they will likely also put it to subcommittee. So now I'm going to stop because I'm getting into dangerous territory, but I'll let Bob or Frank add any additional.
Well, you referred it to a PUD subcommittee. I think what you're referring to is the project review board, which is chaired by Frank, and that is required by the PUD ordinance. This group is not required by the PUD ordinance, but it was committed to by HYM. I believe it was actually referenced in the overlay district, but in any event, this is sort of a voluntary addition to the legally required project review board. I would say one other thing about the significance of that last item having to do with the Boston Revere Connection. As was discussed last time, obviously there are issues that are decided in one community that have impacts on the other community, and I think it's important that they be coordinated. But But on a higher level, and perhaps equally or more importantly, the mix of uses that we are planning for in Revere takes quite explicitly into account the mix of uses that are being proposed in Boston. Because we knew from the start that our priority on commercial development as opposed to residential development was reciprocated on the other side, where their preference is more for residential and commercial development. So the two fit together into a development plan for the site as a whole, which kind of reinforces each municipality's preferences. And I don't think either one can be understood completely in isolation from the other. So I think that's one of the other reasons that we want this to be highlighted.
Part of my question relative to the process and all of this is, and for example, I remember in one of the meetings, Frank brought up an issue about maybe looking at putting the electrical wiring below ground along Winthrop Ave and stuff like that. Things of that nature will be details that will end up within this document.
Yeah, correct. So one thing we're going to have is you're going to see, when we go talk about traffic mitigation and community benefits, there's going to be a detailed listing of what we've committed to a lot of stuff already. So the open space, the roads, the off-site traffic mitigation, those will be detailed in here. There may be some things that are missing or not quite in there yet, and this is what this committee is supposed to do, is to say, because we've clearly have heard the undergrounding of Winthrop Avenue in terms of the utility poles and everything else. That was not part of our original proposal. We very much expect that will become probably a condition of us. So if you don't see something in here that may have been talked about, it may still be that we're still evaluating it, trying to understand it. And I think we talked about this before, we're trying to understand the universe of asks too as well, right? So because we have state, Boston, and Revere all asking for stuff. So we're trying to balance out what we can include as we go forward. But you will clearly see what we've committed to. And then I think it's the role of this DAG as well as the PRB to say, okay, well, that's great, but there's a few other things that we need in this, and we're going to continue to have that dialogue. I have clearly heard, though, the Winthrop Avenue utility poles. Every time I see Frank looks right at me and he brings it up.
And Frank's group is required to provide to the city council an order of conditions which will include precisely such requirements. It will, of course, reference the document, but there may be things in the order of conditions that aren't as fully developed in the document.
I know about the stretch of it already. But so going back to this chapter, and in particular as it relates to the first bullet, expand on benefits and impact to neighboring community. Most of my notes that I'll submit to you guys afterwards, suggestions or whatever, surrounded somewhere in there more clearly stating or stating more emphatically, I guess, for lack of a better word, the project, HYM's commitment to ensuring that the project is inclusive of the neighborhood. The things that we talked about last week about, trying to make sure that Beachmont Square becomes all of Beachmont Square, instead of just within the project and things of that nature. So I think there's some verbiage that probably needs to be added to that area to kind of indicates more clearly that that's a stated goal of this project.
Agreed. And again, I think you'll see things in here that have really come about because of your guys' comments already, and so we continue to look forward to your comments or your suggestions. Again, we've had a very open dialogue. If we start hitting some pressure pain points, we'll say we need to talk about it more. Or there may be some things, I'll give you an example. We talked about community program related to the Innovation Center, right? It's too early for us to figure out what the program is going to be, but what you're going to see in here is a clear commitment by us to work with the community in the city of Revere to provide appropriate programming for the local neighborhood, for workforce training, things like that. But there may be some things that are more committed to, we're going to further work on it with you guys, as opposed to, some things are hard to detail this early on. But that's just a level of detail that you'll see as we go through this.
Notwithstanding Tom's suggestion, I would ask that if you have any comments, please send them through me. Not only because I can get them to Tom, but I can also get them to all of the other members of this group and the peer review group as well.
So just going back to this chapter, so what this chapter is really an overview. I wouldn't call it an executive summary, it's just really an overview, so someone could read through this and get a good sense of everything about the project without reading through the next 300 pages, but that's what chapter 1 is about. And so the idea is it's to touch on all the important elements that are going through it. So I'll move on unless there's other major comments. Okay, I would go, that's going the wrong way. Okay, So master plan mix of uses, what you're going to start to see again is that we gave you guys a comprehensive presentation on this, right? So we went through the uses, we talked about it, things like that. This chapter in many ways really follows that, so it provides a lot of detail on the mix of uses. One of the things is that, again, we met last week with the PRB. They asked for some additional detail on the residential uses, and again, this was more of an oversight on us. We had it in the presentation, so we're just adding more detail in the residential. So we're talking about the senior housing component, the condo component, the apartments component, adding the detail in the proposed unit mix, which was really important. Again, we've talked about this several times, but just being very clear that we're committed to providing 10% of our retail, to local businesses at more flexible lease terms is how we called it. Winthrop Avenue has come up very consistently, time and time again, of how we're treating that. So we're going to just focus a lot more attention and detail on that. We've talked about it, we've shown some renderings, but really just to be able to really walk through it more methodically so people understand that the whole stretch of Winthrop Avenue is very important to us, so it's not the back sides of the building. We do have challenges with how do we pull retail all the way up the street, but we're really excited about it, so we're going to focus on that. Even though this is only a master plan, we're also going to provide some additional details just to give people a better sense of what we're thinking about street furniture, lighting, more thematic type concepts so that people can understand. Again, we're going to be coming back through site plan review for all the phases and buildings, but just to get a better sense of it. And then again, you'll see this consistently, and Bob already mentioned this, but how this mix of uses complements what Boston's looking for, right? And to talk about a little bit about what Boston is getting to as well. So I'm going to pause there and see if people have material comments on Chapter 2. And again, this doesn't have to be methodical, but just throwing it out there. Yep, I can share.
Thanks. Alexa Smith with MAPC. I'm not sure if the discussion has developed since a few months ago when you presented on this, but I would put forward that there should also be a commitment to inclusionary affordable housing in here.
I think we've continued to try and think about it, as a topic. I would say there's two big things that have continued to come up on this topic. One is the cost of construction relative to how the revenue works in this market in Revere. Every other project that we compete against doesn't have those units in them, right? So, and there's a reason for that. There's only so much rent. There's only so much in the way of condo prices. And the costs kind of are what they are. So the project itself is really tight, and the numbers don't work. That's kind of number one. I'd say the second thing for us is the clear direction that we've gotten from particularly members of the city council is that there's not a desire to do that politically, I think, on the site. We are committed on the Boston side, if I could just add, if everybody in Revere would just block their ears for a second, we certainly are committed to do everything that the city of Boston requires, for housing, and that will produce a significant amount of affordable housing for the entire site, but it'll be in Boston.
But none in Revere.
Correct. Yeah, and I would just, if I could just add to Alexis, I think to explain the sort of the political position, I think for the leadership in Revere, every community has to make choices, and one of the choices that the city of Revere has made is a priority for the city of Revere is to build commercial office space, right? That's a huge thing. There's very little in the way of commercial office space in Revere. And so part of the way we've responded to that need is to suggest, obviously, that we'll build an innovation center, which is a significant expense for us, right? So it's not that we're not doing something to meet a priority that the city has outlined for us. The priority that the city has outlined for us is try and foster the creation of commercial office space. That's the alternative. So, that's the clear objective. Now, clearly on the Boston side, the objective on the part of the mayor of Boston is we need more housing, we'd like affordable housing, and so we're meeting that objective as best we can. So we're doing the best we can to hit the political objectives as for each of the cities. How's that?
The question I had was related to the 10% retail commitment, and I'm trying to understand if I'm looking at, the Beachmont Square end of it, what that translates. I mean, I think it was 250,000 square feet of retail space, and I did a quick thing, said, okay, that's 2,500 square feet, I think.
25,000.
25,000, excuse me.
One more zero.
So my question then, thank you, was when you look at 25,000 square feet, what does that translate into the number of retail stores or restaurants?
So you know, again, most retail establishments, especially neighborhood retail, probably they can range anywhere as low as 500 square feet up to 5,000 square feet would be like a mid-sized restaurant. So when you start translating that, that could be, you know, easily, you know, 10 to 15 businesses, you know, and it really depends on, you know, so again, we talked about this before too. Our goal is that we want a really diverse unit mix. We're also looking at attracting a lot of local businesses too as well, especially successful businesses that are maybe looking for a second location. Our goal is not to suck the life out of any other location in Revere. It's really to be complementary to it. And the reason why we say flexible lease terms is that we've found out some vendors definitely want lower rent. Some actually need more flexible lease terms, you know, or don't have credit, right? So one thing for us too, by the way, this is very risky for us because that means that we usually end up with a lot of retailers that don't have a track record, right? Which means they don't have credit enhancement, which means that even though we lease it, we don't get credit from the lender, you know, for that space, which means that we're taking an impact on the loan, things like that. So the only reason why I'm saying is that it's going to be flexible, and we're going to be working with the city to try to figure out what the appropriate parameters are.
Okay, and you know, it's funny, when I was asking the question, I almost forgot it, and that was 10% of the retail space is going to be dedicated to favorable lease terms for Revere businesses, is that correct?
Correct.
Right, and so there would be other retail
Correct.
in addition to that. And then the other question, and I think you answered it, and I just want to make sure I got it right, had to do with the residential units. And to the other question that came up earlier, of course, there's ongoing discussions about how many residential units should be within the package in the project at the Revere end. I'm not sure that's been totally resolved yet, but that kind of leads to when will that be resolved? And what are we going to see in this first phase, and will that be addressed in that phasing section that we get to see?
Yeah, so there's a couple things you'll see. When you go into this will have, we definitely have translated, because you saw in the presentation, to a very specific number of units that talks about apartment number of units, condo number of units, and senior housing units. The one thing we always say that when we get to a decision document, we always look for some flexibility, right? Because some things never are exact. But it will detail how much the residential square footage changes to number or translates to number of units. So you'll see that. So that's clear. And I forgot your second question.
Phase one.
Oh, phase one. Yeah. So all the phases are clearly defined, clearly showing the amount of square footage for each type of use, and it will also show the percentage breakdown of uses by that phase and the cumulative percentage as each phase goes on to it. So again, it was the same ones that we showed in the presentation, but it shows you how, you know, we go from where we start and how do we get to eventually 50-50 so that we get to that 50% commercial commitment. And so that hasn't changed. And so you'll see that, which is very clear. And that's going to be in the chapter that's coming on phasing. And it's the exact same diagrams that you guys saw actually in the presentation with a lot more narrative.
Just to comment on the importance of Chapter 2 generally, there are 3 chapters, topics that are most important to the community from what I hear. One is traffic and transportation, obviously. The second is municipal impacts, and the third is the mix of uses. And Chapter 2, as now written, obviously would benefit from the kind of detail you're talking about, but it needs something more weighty, literally, to demonstrate how important this issue is to the community, especially if people go to that chapter first or second or maybe third and don't read the whole document. The other point I would make goes back to Alexis's comment. I think, Tom, you are correct that you have been responsive to the priorities of the city council, the administration, with regard to your commitment to 50% commercial, and also with your approach to affordable housing. I do think, however, this chapter would benefit from more of an explanation of the rationale for those decisions. Now, some of that falls on the city because you're responding to our priorities, and we need to explain that. But the reason, as you alluded to, that we are interested in commercial development is because our job base has been decimated with the loss of this facility, Wonderland, Necco, etc. I mean, I think now our biggest employer is Stop and Shop. I mean, we need to rebuild our job and employment base. And we are asking you to make the commitment to do that, including subsidizing that perhaps at the expense of subsidizing housing. But I think that requires a more sort of proactive explanation from you and from us in this chapter, because otherwise it begs the question about why aren't we doing in Revere what's being done in Boston, etc. There are some good reasons for that, but they need to be explicated.
I think we can think that through a little bit, so we'll spend a little time on that. I mean, Boston, the extent of commercial development in Boston is obvious, right? If you get up on the Tobin Bridge and you look down at Boston, Boston does very well with commercial tax base, and Revere needs commercial property, right? So that's so yeah, I think we can probably find a way to write something that, that is appropriate with that.
I think part of that is our responsibility too, as Alexis knows. MAPC has communicated to the mayor what their concerns and priorities are, and we will be addressing that both directly with MAPC as well as, sharing with the group. So I think part of that burden falls to us. There are legitimate questions, but I think there are appropriate answers.
Yes, I agree.
Do you have a question? I saw your hand, so
Yeah.
you can take it back though if you don't.
No, it's all right. So I had a question about. Oh, sorry, I'm Juan from Senator Boncori's office. Can you, and sorry for the Revere crew, but the senator represents East Boston as well. So we were just wondering, what does the commitment for, and actually the first question should be, what are you guys looking at as affordable housing, right? Because AMI, for a one bedroom is $1,500, right? So maybe if you can expand on in this chapter about that definition. The follow-up question to that is, what does that look like for your commitments in Boston?
So remember, in Boston, the requirement, by executive order essentially is that 13% of your units in Boston, if you're building a market rate project, 13% of your units must be made affordable to people who are within a certain percentage of the area median income, AMI. The percentages, it is typically formally established by a combination of the Department of Neighborhood Development and the BPDA, the Boston Planning and Development Agency. And so typically the developer presents a plan for a specific building, and the plan must involve a plan for the provision of those 13%, those units. The units must be across the entire mix. They must be equally distributed across the entire mix of units, and they must be equally distributed throughout the building, essentially. And no difference, obviously, in terms of access to those units or any of those sorts of things, or the level of build out of those units. Typically for an area median income, number that ranges between, say 65% of AMI to maybe 85% or 90%. It depends on the area of the city where this is done. Some areas of the city have different needs and have requested some different versions of that AMI, but that range, is probably around anywhere from an annual income of $55,000 a year at the low end to maybe $75,000 or so, or maybe $80,000 at the higher end of that. So typically, these are people who are obviously working, right? These are families that are municipal officials or things like that. So it's a clear need.
I might just add too on the housing issue. From the Revere's perspective, there is the question of what housing is developed on this site. And there is the related question about what impact it would have on the affordability of housing in Revere generally. Unlike many neighborhoods in Boston, including increasingly East Boston, the housing stock in Revere is still relatively affordable. And what our priority is to maintaining that affordability. And HYM has committed to work with us, with our not-for-profit organizations, our housing authority, and otherwise, to support the city of Revere's effort to maintain the affordability of existing housing. And in the end, we think that would probably be more important than the percentage of housing beyond senior housing, of which you have 10%, that will actually occur on this site. So I need to recognize your commitment, as on the workforce development, to work with the city on priorities in the surrounding community.
Yeah, I would say as a region, right? So this is not, what I'm about to say is not specific to Revere. I'm saying as a region, we in the greater Boston area have not done a good job of building housing for decades. Like literally, if you just take the city of Boston as an example, I worked, many of you know, I worked for the city of Boston in a planning and development capacity through the 90s. And, in the city of Boston, I can report to you that from a period from World War II until about 1997, there literally were no large residential buildings built, or, what you call residential towers. The first residential tower to be built in Boston was built in 1999. That was really the first one. And so literally we went through decades of when there was no housing built. And so the challenges that we see now are really supply related. Those are the basic issues. And so when we come back to this issue with specific regard to Revere, what's needed is all types of housing. And that's what we've tried to pull together here is, particularly in working with the mayor and with Bob and with Frank and the city council, what we've tried to do here is create a plan that meets priority one for the city, which is build commercial property, right? So try and build office as best we can in a city that has not built office. So there's no track record. It's hard for us to get tenants to do this just on a whim today. So we need to make this a place where people will live, as I've said, a number of different times. And if we can make it a place where people will live, then we think we'll attract the office piece. But we want that community to be a place where a variety of people live. So therefore, 10% of our housing units will be senior housing, 55 plus housing. A good portion of our units will be home ownership units, condos. A portion of them certainly will be rental, because that is the piece that is most readily financed today in the market. But we want to build housing on a variety of different levels in Revere because it's an important regional approach. And then in Boston, clearly the priorities are a little bit more because there's less of a need for commercial property, certainly in Boston, but there's a big need recognized in the regional approach, or the regional need for housing, that's for sure.
I would just clarify one thing. Our emphasis on the commercial certainly includes office, but it also includes importantly retail, restaurant, hotels, etc., where a lot of jobs are also created to which the Revere community can be immediately responsible.
Yep. So one of the things I would say too, we're probably the most unique site in the greater Boston area that can actually add 7,000 to 10,000 housing units on one site under one control, which is very unique. And doing it without displacing a single person, because there's nothing here today. That's really unique, and that's really important from our perspective. We're also a different site in that because we're so large, we're not, again, you guys are familiar with some of the recent sites that you guys have seen going up on Ocean Avenue and, in other places in Revere. They're not building a 40-acre open space system on site, right? They're also not, they have their roads. We don't have any of our roads on site. So the amount of money we need to spend just to get to this site to be developed is pretty immense. Plus, because of the scale of our site, and you'll see this in the traffic mitigation too, we're not just fixing Winthrop Avenue, Route 1A next to us, we're going much farther out. And the one thing you'll see in the traffic study, our traffic study takes into account the following. It takes in the existing conditions that already exist, which means there's so many failing intersections in the area that have to be addressed. So we start there. And you guys have seen the queues on Route 1A where we have 400 cars stuck behind Boardman Street on a daily basis because they can't get through. We then, in our traffic study, put in all of the proposed or projected projects, which Frank has helped out given what's in Revere and East Boston. There's over 3 million square feet of projects that exist in this area that is picked up in our traffic study. Then we put background growth on it, and then we put our traffic into it, and then we go fix it. And so the amount of offsite improvements that we have too as well. So I just want to put that in perspective too. So beyond trying to get the commercial going and everything else, this is really kind of we're putting a lot of effort and capital into this to try to get it going, so.
Just to follow up on the issue with the Boston end and all of that, of course, we read in the newspaper where Mayor Walsh upped his goals 30%. And I guess the question comes down to, does that translate to more housing units on the Boston end in this project versus commercial, retail, office space?
So our plan still hasn't changed, but you may remember, a couple things. We committed to Revere, minimum 50% commercial. Zoning, we're committed to that. Remember, we always had these two programs, though, and the toggle now is much more on the Boston side. So I don't want to use the word, but if Amazon doesn't come, right, we would not build 8 million square feet of commercial office space across the site. It was never the plan. So there's likely could be more housing, and that 8 million could go to 5.5, and the idea is that we would build 2.5 million square feet of more housing. that more likely probably translates on the Boston side, because again, we're committed to the 50% on the Revere side. We're not going down. Our hope, again, is to go higher. So it's a minimum, not a maximum. But there's probably potentially more opportunity for housing over time. Now, when we say that, we don't know what Amazon's going to do yet. We're also going to see where the market goes, you know. But as we know from our experience at North Point and other places, you got to get the site going first, and then get the commercial tenants to follow. And that's what happened at Assembly Row and a few other places. So, but I think that there's real opportunity for more housing as we go forward. But that would probably be more on the Boston side.
And to answer Ed's question, the coverage of the mayor's new initiative explicitly referenced, I think, in all of the articles, East Boston and in some cases Suffolk Downs.
Correct.
Obviously the Boston portion. So clearly they have in mind this area.
Correct.
And I guess I hear what you're saying. If Amazon doesn't come, that probably won't be as much retail office space, but ultimately, and I think in early days, it was the discussion, well, if Amazon doesn't come, you know, if Amazon comes, the project's built in 5 to 10 years. If it doesn't come, then it's 10 to 15 years or whatever overall. But there wasn't any discussion about changing, I don't think, unless I didn't listen, the office residential mix to more residential instead of office. And it's a little concerning because, you know, what's happening is Boston is driving the additional residential demand for this project that could very well impact what we're trying to do with this end, because one does not happen without affecting the other.
You can see Revere from where we stand right here, and you can see Boston from where we stand right here. The demand is regional. The people who are making decisions about where they want to live are making decisions, for the most part, probably about that blue line, right? So whether they live at Suffolk Downs T-Stop or Beachmont T-Stop, they're not thinking about, I live in Revere, or especially if they work in downtown Boston. So the demand is here no matter what. It's here. And to the extent that there's, you know, housing stock in Revere that is, you know, that is turning over or that people find attractive or whatever, it's going to come. The only way to address the demand is to build more housing. And that's what Boston's about. But we totally get that Revere is saying to us, we don't want you to just build housing. We want this site. This site is so valuable to Revere. Revere says we also have this other priority, which is we'd like you to build commercial office, retail, and hotel. So we get that.
And that's an unequivocal commitment
Yes.
in the zoning, in this document, and otherwise, which cannot be changed unilaterally.
I'm happy to talk more. I mean, a lot of this is a philosophical discussion, right? So it is. So I'm happy to talk to you more about it, Ed, because it's a topic. I've been working on this for 25 years, and you know, there were times we said, okay, we should take all the tax foreclosed property, we should make that available, we should build more housing. There were times we said, no, we got to take, you know, this, we got to build over the highways, we got to build over town, we got to build more housing. The only thing that works, you know, is build more housing to address this issue. That's the only thing that works. And as a region, we've done a terrible job of building housing for decades, literally for decades. I mean, you just look at the housing stock, you go across the entire region, is, yes, there are some new towers here and there, but for the most part, the single-family housing stock, the 2- and 3-family housing stock has not really been renovated very well. There's you know, many good owners, but there's not enough capital out there to renovate it, so we have an old housing stock and not enough of it.
And don't get me wrong, and my primary concern about the whole thing, and I talk about impacts, has to do with what we'll be talking about at the next meeting, traffic.
Yes.
And that whole ability to support that increase of residential units. I mean, the more traffic, the more everything that comes with that. And it's one thing to meet a demand, but you got to build the infrastructure to meet that.
Can I surprise you for 1 second? Which is the impact on traffic on the office side is heavier than the impact on residential. The residential is easier for us to make work because most of the residential will be focused on getting on that blue line. So that already exists. The office, many of the office workers will be coming here from other places. So, you know, they'll drive because it's not easy to get here from, you know, wherever you're coming from, right? So the traffic impacts are less for housing, more for commercial.
Thank you.
Yep.
I stand educated. Thank you.
Chapter 3. I think we killed that topic. Well, I have one more commentary. Obviously, the one thing you're seeing in the articles too on housing, there's a push by the state to focus on a lot of other communities that are not Boston or Revere, who are not providing their share of housing, and in fact have effectively, outzoned any type of multifamily or apartments or other issues. So there's a larger regional issue here that even though Boston has been creating housing, Revere has been creating housing, there's many communities that have not been creating housing and really show no interest in it, which needs to be a focus of the state too as well. All right, so Chapter 3, Public Open Space Network and Natural Resources. Again, we've gone through this pretty detailed in the presentations. We are adding, this was more just an oversight, but we are putting back in, or being more clear, we talked about inclusion of public art, historic racetrack elements, additional detail in the community programming and the Innovation Center. Again, this is going to be an outline of what could be or what could come into it. But the idea is that this is really a commitment that needs to be, we'll commit to in the special permit, it'll become a condition, and then we'll be working on this over time as we move forward with the Innovation Center. And the other thing too is just really clear, this is one thing that came from this community, particularly Bob, but the idea is that everything on the site is ADA accessible, right? The sidewalks, the parks and everything, but this was different. This was meant to be literally a playground that's really designed around those with disabilities or different needs, and so really clear there. This chapter also goes into the other types of parks, dog parks, aspirational type things. Again, it kind of gives you a menu of parks, but the idea is that when we come back for each phase, then we'll get into the details. Okay, here's specifically what we think is going to be in this area, and we'll be back with this committee as well as the PRB as we go through it. But obviously, it also shows too, the one thing that comes up in the phasing diagrams do show what open space comes with each phase too as well for clarity, which I think is helpful as well. That's more in the phasing section, not in the open space section, but you kind of see the sum of the parts. And we also do put in the phasing section. I think we have the Boston as well that lines up with it at the end. So you're going to see it first Revere, and then you're going to be able to see how it works with Boston as we go through. So questions, comment?
One note,
Yep.
one note with regard to that. As many times as you emphasize it, including in Chapter 3, the question continually comes up, is this truly publicly accessible open space? And you almost can't emphasize that enough.
Yep.
Because it keeps coming up as an issue.
Yep. No, so it's a good point. So this is the reason why, so this is the network. That's the 40 acres. You'll notice there's no sidewalks on Main Street that are, this is just pure open space system. It purposely connects from one side of the neighborhoods to the other side, always connecting to a public street or off-site, so that it really is meant to be an open space network. One of the other things, going back to costs, not only are we constructing this, we're maintaining this 40-acre open space system. So this is not a burden to the city of Revere, or to the city of East Boston. So Revere and East Boston residents suddenly just got 40 acres of publicly accessible open space for not a dime on tax dollar, which is pretty significant. And the way it's maintained is what we do is we do a common area charge, so all the buildings that are on the site end up paying for it, and they contribute to it. We did this at North Point, and if you guys have ever gone to North Point in East Cambridge, there's a 5-acre central common right in the middle of it, which is absolutely spectacular. And so I think it's a really kind of an important element just to throw into there. The other thing which you'll see too, we talk about is that, and again, this is in, on the Boston side, but we have almost a 3.5-acre kind of level informal playing field. The goal is that we are going to be programming this as well for community interaction too as well. So, and that's meant to be, even though it's on the Boston side, it's meant to be for both cities, right? So the idea is that we may run out, 5-year-old kid soccer doesn't have a place to go on Sunday morning. The answer is we want to try to work that out. And so to have festivals and things like that, so.
Just as an example, though, one of the conditions would be that this open space be dedicated as public open space in perpetuity.
Yep.
Become part of the city's recreation network.
Yep.
In open space.
Yeah. And we've done this different ways before. We've done it with, first of all, Cambridge did it through just their permits, right? So it was very clear. The project was approved and it had this as open space system. We've also done it at times by easement. So we'll work on the right, first way, it's open space in perpetuity, and the goal is that Revere should never worry about, or East Boston should worry about that it goes away. That's not the goal, because it's part of the permits.
Just to pick up on Frank's point, and this wasn't mentioned so much last week, but it occurs to me it's a point worth making. If this is, in fact, as Frank suggests, part of the open space network for East Boston and for Revere, you should perhaps pay some attention to what exists now, because there are certain things that you don't have to provide because they're already provided elsewhere. And I think particularly about active ball fields and so on. So if you are explicit in describing not only what you're doing here, but how it relates to and does not duplicate but complement what's going on around you, that's, I think, an important point about the interface between this project and the community.
Yeah. We definitely agree, and I think, again, there's also some other things that, like I said, don't exist today. The outdoor performance theater, very unique space, right, where we want community performances to happen, right? And during the day, it binds people sitting eating lunch. You know, the plaza spaces on both at Beachmont Square as well as Belle Isle Square really provide an opportunity for more, you know, plaza space so that small festivals can happen, food trucks can come, farmers markets. So, yeah, but we'll definitely, it's a good point.
I might also say with regard to that, that MAPC and the city of Revere has just updated its open space plan. So you've got a document there that is pretty detailed and documenting what exists now and what's likely to exist in the future.
So one of the, this is what we did at North Point too. This is an important point because this site will be built over 15 to 20 years. You're a little fast. That's great. I would love to do it, but someone might die in the office, our office. But the reason why we bring up we don't over-program the space is because, to be honest, we don't know what's needed 10 years from today, nor do you guys really know what's needed in 10 years today. And also, buildings could end up shifting. You know, when I say our uses could end up shifting, right, which may shift what the park wants to be next to it or something like that. But the reason why we keep that is that we are coming back for each phase and we'll have a better sense of what we need.
Bob Eulig from Halverson Design.
Yep.
We've talked about how the public from Revere approaches the site a lot from Beachmont. And we've talked about the open space and trying to make it publicly accessible and appear publicly accessible. Can you talk a little bit about how the green open space, when it extends up, and I know there's wetlands up there, but adjacent to up where the public safety facility is, how is that going to appear such that that can be really appear like a gateway? Because there's clearly challenges once you get further down Winthrop Avenue to connect to the community. So if I'm a community member across Winthrop Ave, down by that public safety complex, when I come upon it, it seems like that's the place where I really want to enter the green space. And how do you feel like that's articulated such that people feel like that's a gateway into the open space at that point?
No, it's a great question. So what we actually have a community path that is right here, right next to North Shore Road, that actually comes right in along Sales Creek, and well, I think it's Green Creek, but Sales Creek right through here and comes straight down and then connects into the full park system. We also have the cycle track that actually goes all the way through right to Winthrop Avenue too as well. Remember, we have a cycle track that also, because remember, we pushed the buildings back 20 feet, so we have a cycle track as well as a sidewalk along Winthrop Avenue, so really presenting a really robust network. So this is very much open space entry. It'll probably have some type of active node along that, some passive seating areas. Then you have the cycle track kind of main entry. Then you remember you have that Main Street district, and then you have the plaza. So the idea is there's at least 4 points that are clearly marked that are they're not vehicular, they're really like purposeful kind of entry points, and so that it feels fluid. Because we were always, we want to make sure that this neighborhood right on the North Shore Road has literally a direct entry into the park system. I mean, some people may walk down Winthrop, which is still going to be very beautiful, but they come right in and they're in the whole network. Again, and we talked about this before, if you want a 1.5 mile walk, there's a beautiful 1.5 mile walk right through the site there. But again, the idea was for it to be seamless too, so that someone could literally walk to Orient Heights, or get to Wally Street. And we talked about the cycle track network too as well, which is pretty extensive. City of Boston is working on a facility on Wally Street, so at one point, you'll literally be able to bike all the way through the site to Winthrop Avenue too, like on purposeful cycle tracks, which is separate from community paths too, by the way.
And just to the west of that, what is the thinking of that? Because it'll be great that there's cycle track along Winthrop Avenue, and I'm not necessarily saying this is your responsibility, but, in hopes that this doesn't look like the world comes to an end once you get to the end of the site, but that there's, clearly the sense that this goes beyond or improvements at that intersection that make the crossing of that intersection as an invitation into the cycle track really well conceived.
So there's so part of our mitigation package is upgrades to the North Shore Road and Winthrop Avenue intersection, and we'll be taking a very close look at how that interacts. Our means end at a certain point, though, but the idea is at some point it goes back into the existing sidewalks that exist on both sides of Revere Beach Boulevard. And again, we're literally giving up 20 feet of our land to even create this in the first place. And so obviously beyond that, we run into the fire station and police station. That makes it a little bit more difficult for us to extend that. Not to say that, you know, in 15, 20 years, or, you know, who knows what's happening with traffic, hopefully it goes down. I'm not sure that'll ever happen, but, you know. Oh, yeah, so that's the other thing, too. So we have, and this will be actually in our MIPA filing, we have been working with VHB, so we have shown a extension, and this was in our earlier discussions, too, as well. We do have a community path extension that goes from Orion Heights all the way along Bennington Street, through Beachmont Square. I'm going to stop saying Donnelly Square, Beachmont Square, and then basically up to Elliott Circle. And we have figured out, I'm going to say 87% of it, because there's enough width in most of the segment. We're still working on how it gets through Beachmont Square. That's the toughest part. But the idea is that someone literally could be on the East Boston Greenway from the waterfront all the way to Revere Beach, and then once you're at Revere Beach, you have 3.5 miles of, you know, boardwalk area that you can go up. We haven't done anything through Elliott Circle yet, because again, I know the city of Revere is looking at Elliott Circle, so we get it to Elliott Circle. I think there'll have to be a different discussion as we get beyond that point. The other tough segment is just literally from Constitution Beach to get to the Orient Heights station, because there's some residential streets that have very little width. But once we get to Bennington Street, we pretty much have a consistent community path all the way up to Revere Beach, with some, you know, road diet, we'll call it, some shifting of parking spaces, you know, around, but it'll be in there. And the idea is to meet with City of Boston and City of Revere and kind of go through what that means within those specific areas so everyone understands it. And there are a couple options of how we do that, but from our perspective, really important connector. And the idea, remember, I mean, our cycle track gets right to underneath the Beachmont station, and then the path is right across Bennington Street on the other side. So people are probably walking across the street to get to it, but we're now at least starting to get this whole spine put together, which is a key item from our perspective. Okay.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4, Roadway and Infrastructure Network. Again, the comments that came up, which we had some detail, we're going to be better at it, but I think as you may know, the big thing about this is that long-term, all of the sanitary sewer is going to go through East Boston, direct connection to the MWRA line, which is huge, because that means that we're really not, you know, you're getting tax revenue and you're not getting any of the sewer. But there does need to be an interim connection that we have talked about too for the first phase 1R, which would connect into Revere's existing system. So we're going to expand upon that in more detail, talk about the phasing of it, the capacity of it. As a reminder, we are required to do I&I mitigation, which is inflow and infiltration mitigation, which in Revere is for every gallon of sewer you put in, you got to take 10 gallons of, you know, basically stormwater that's going into the sewer system, which means we should never be overtaxing the system. So if we have to put, you know, 100,000 gallons into the system, that means we're taking 1 million gallons out. So in the interim, we should be improving the situation tenfold. Even if we were to improve it 1-to-1 only, it would still be great. But then eventually the idea is that after that phase 1 is built, as we build up the site, this will be switched over and will go through the Boston side. So it's only an interim condition. And then honestly, when we cross over, that means there's capacity that goes right back to Revere that could be used for other projects. So we're going to talk about that. More details on stormwater hydrology and just expanding on benefits.
Just to be clear on that, interim is a relative term. I think what you have described as interim probably runs to 5 years or more. It's not a year or two.
Yeah, correct. So it's in the scale, the time frame of this project, it's interim, but in some of the other projects, yeah, correct. So the way it works is the reason why we're doing the interim is that, I think we talked about this before, all of our roadways and utilities need to be surcharged on the site because it's a former fill site. So for us to run a sanitary line in the early phase is extremely expensive for us, and it's very disruptive to the site. So it's going to have to wait until we get into this middle section, which again is not a 1 to 2 year type thing. It could be 5 to 7 years type thing. And that's all subject to market conditions. But the goal is, I mean, honestly, we want to as soon as possible build this out so we can take it that way anyways. But it's not, interim is probably midterm, is probably a better way of saying it. Talk about more about stormwater hydrology, which we do, but get into more details of how it benefits Sales Creek and the Belle Isle Marsh. Just provide additional details of, what telecom capabilities we're providing in the public spaces. So, for example, the outdoor performance theater is really meant to be geared that it's I want to say that there's conduits, it's hardwired to, people can show up with speakers and systems and things like that. So there's backbone to these things, public Wi-Fi type of stuff. We have been exploring alternate energy sources, wind and solar, in the MIPA document, so we'll make sure we also include it here so it's clear. And the rest of it, again, this is really the hardcore one that really shows you the on-site roadway network, where loading docks are, front entrances are, street sections. Remember, we went through all the street sections, so all that detail is going to be in this section. So that's chapter 4.
I have a question. Surprise. Stormwater management,
Yes.
I think, falls within this area here. So I guess my question is, when we look at the open spaces, and one of the things was that big open air little lake with the music thing around it and all of that, and that was going to be water retention area to help in retaining stormwater and the management of stormwater when there are big storms. At what point in time does that capability, if you will, come online? And during the first phase, for example, in the Beachmont Square section, are we going to be susceptible to flooding and whatnot, because maybe some of that's not there yet?
So here's the good news. So it's a really good question. So it's talking about stormwater retention, the improvements when they come online. Every phase, even every building, is required to mitigate peak flows. So we can't increase the peak runoff rate of the site. We're also required to, we typically retain 1 inch of rainwater too as well, just up front for irrigation and other purposes. So as soon as we build this out, Beachmont's going to see a pretty immediate improvement, because we're already starting to control stormwater here in the new project, which is not being controlled today. It's just basically sheet flowing away, or it's going right into Sales Creek. This is not built until phase 2. However, this is also an existing pond today, or a smaller pond today, as part of the horse racing operation. It's not as deep. So there is some continued benefit from that, even in the interim. But this is phase 2, because it's part of this segment of the site. The other reason why it's phase 2 is because that outdoor performance theater is a very expensive piece for us to build. And we're already building another very expensive piece in the first phase. So again, the key for us is being able to, phase over these open space improvements as we go through it. But that'll be in the second phase.
I think it will be very interesting to see what the benefits are for Sales Creek upstream and Belle Isle downstream. But one of the questions that occurs to me along the lines that Ed was suggesting, we are having an immediate flooding issue
Correct.
on a regular basis involving the Blue Line. Since this is such a vital transportation link, the credibility of which for the longer term could be compromised by what happens in the shorter term. Are there any measures that you will be taking on site that will mitigate the increasingly problematic situation of flooding of the Blue Line, particularly across Denver?
I think the key to the property, to the region, was addressed around 30 years ago by Representative Bob Lillian about the dredging of Sales Creek. It was much needed back then. Unfortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers came in, the mud was tested, it was too polluted to do a sea drop, so again, it became too expensive. So there's plenty of studies there. I think it's vital to the Beachmont area to get Sales Creek dredged. And I know it's beyond your purview, but you can be our biggest cheerleader with the state. I know it's on Bob Leo's radar. And the flooding that exists now, we had cars during the rainstorm last winter at the Beachmont School. We lost 3 teachers' cars because the water just comes over. It floods.
Well, one, with the MIPA filing, remember, we were asked to do a climate change study, which is a very detailed analysis, a 3D analysis. So we actually, as part of the MIPA filing, very detailed analysis of how the site, which you guys already know how it floods today, how it's going to flood in, 2035 and 2070. And it's looking at increased sea level rise as well as increased precipitation events. Yep. So as each phase goes forward, it's definitely going to improve the existing, condition that you guys have over today. Unfortunately, like everything else, until we get the site fully built out, the full benefit is not until we get fully built out. We're happy to work with the City of Revere on if there's other interim conditions or measures that have to be made. We're holistically just first looking at the site and how it's working together. The one thing it does show, which you guys know, is that we talked about this before, the weak point is right through the parking lot, right? So we're looking at a lot of mitigation measures that work through here, but we did look at the vulnerabilities to this area, Beachmont, as well as the MBTA tracks. It's very clear that probably I'm going back to shorter term versus midterm, but it clearly identifies that there needs to be some type of barrier that runs along the school and along Bennington Street that really solves this issue more long-term, right? Because our improvements on our site, definitely help here upstream in the 1,000 homes that is north of us or above us. The unfortunate part, we're here, and this area is here, which means the water is already here before it gets to our site. And so that's one of the issues so this probably helps with, we're slowing down water that's coming through the neighborhood before it gets to the pump station. It's not helping at all when the Atlantic Ocean comes over Bennington Street, because it's going the other way. So one of the things that you'll see as well is that we're talking about, and this will be in the MEPA filing, the cycle track that we just talked about. There's a discussion of, which is well beyond us, but could be very interesting for the state. Why raise the MBTA track? Can you imagine how expensive and disruptive that would be? Why raise Bennington Street? You know how expensive that would be? If we're going to go put a community path that's 12 feet wide, and there's a lot of right-of-way, why don't we raise the community path, right? So that actually becomes kind of the barrier. And so again, this is very preliminary. It's suggested in the climate change report. We focused on what we can do for our area and really for the upstream properties, even to the point of where there's a suggestion of a second tide gate, because right now when this one gets overflowed, we're actually 2.5 feet higher than Bennington Street. And so what's happening is once it overflows, it just goes all up through the system. But the only way to really address it long-term is to do something where, while the cycle track is here, or the community path, a raised barrier system, which again might be part retaining wall on one side, but a natural grass slope down to Belle Isle Marsh. And then the community path keeps going, but that barrier can follow the edge of the playing fields. And it's just something to think about, because that would then really protect, because otherwise, no matter what we do, at some point, East Boston will be an island in every major storm event. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. But I just bring that up because we are thinking about those things.
Yeah, I don't know whether you consider the community path to be a purview or not, but let me just emphasize the importance of Dan's comment. If you have solutions to our problems that go beyond your purview, don't hesitate to offer them, fearing that you're going to own them, because what we really need are solutions that we can get behind as a community with the speaker and otherwise. And if you have any of those kinds of answers, and that one sounds like it has some interesting possibilities, please share them with us publicly, privately, or otherwise.
And I'll say we're sorry.
One of the themes for us is, remember, I think there's been a tremendous need, transportation, water-related, all those things, and we together with you can be an engine to make some of these things happen. So that berm or that whatever, as Doug, whatever we want to call it, as Doug just laid out, that's a relatively simple, so everybody's talking about, do we raise the blue line, do we do whatever, but if you look at that, it's a simpler solution. Now, nothing's easy, so there are downsides to that to be explored, but those are important things that we will raise, and we want to work.
Yeah, and so that is very explicitly, we do state that, in the climate change section, or the report, so as one option. Eventually, something's got to be done on this side, but there's a lot of properties that will be redeveloped, and so there's also the Boston and Maine, right-of-way here too. So there's something very similar could be done on the other side long-term, which makes it a lot easier than the state trying to figure out how to raise Route 1A. But the reason why I bring it up is that, and most of that I just talked about is all within city hands or state hands. So it's there are some pinch points on how it dives back into the Beachmont Hill, through those, that I don't know yet, but it's just something that we thought was really interesting and engaging. And it's not something that has to be done today, right? Or when I say this, you guys are having flooding today, you may want it done as soon as possible, But I can tell you when we look at the 2035 and the 2070 results, it just gets more. I mean, the sea levels rise 1 foot, there's 1 more foot of water in Beachmont because it's just coming across Bennington and nothing is stopping it.
And you know you have an informed advocacy group in the Friends of Belle Isle Marsh, particularly including Joanne down the corner here. So engage them. I'm not sure this solves Belle Isle Marsh problems, but that's a group that has been looking at this for decades, I guess.
Yeah, I think what's good too, when you see the climate change study too as well, these are storm events. So these are not daily tidal actions, but the frequency of storms are going to get more and the flooding of those storms is going to get higher. And so, yeah. Yeah. And so anyways, so I think, first of all, I think it's a great question. I think as to other interim, doing that quickly and fast solves a whole host of interim issues and long-term issues, but that still takes several years to figure out with the state. And then that's something, again, community path is one thing, which we would love to help with. Once we start getting to an elevated section of, a mile-long kind of, berm type system, that's a little bit different for us mentally. But anyways, the reason we talked before, the reason why we're putting it in is because we want you guys to know about it, and so we can talk about it. Frank.
Yeah, one item that also we've defined in this section is water service to the site.
Yes.
We know that we have the adequate water pressure to provide the site through the MWRA system. That'll be defined that you have to tap into that system, not the City Revere system with a water gate, possibly 2 gates on Winthrop Avenue, and provide adequate domestic and fire flow needs of the site.
Correct, and Frank and Bob, really appreciate you guys working on us really early on. It's probably 8 months or 9 months ago where you guys helped us, do some modeling up in that area. So very clear, this has happened in East Boston too as well. So we are definitely, we already committed to this, but we'll show it in this chapter. We're doing direct taps off of the MWA lines that run through Winthrop Avenue, and there will be 2 taps for redundancy purposes. And so that we're not impacting either the Beachmont neighborhood for water pressure or the Orient Heights neighborhood for water pressure, which would probably happen more during a fire event, right? But the answer is there's plenty of capacity from MWA's perspective, and it'll work out well, and it'll still be a Revere city meter, just in case anyone's wondering who's selling the water. So we're still buying water from Revere.
I shared with you this morning some comments from one of our peer review group consultants, ACOM. They had commented on the TOD strategies in a very complimentary way. Also had a number of observations that are way above my technical capability involving chapters 4 and 7. I don't think we need to go over them in detail here today, but I just want to note for you, they seem well-informed, precise, appropriate, and if you think not, let me know. But it sounded to me like they were appropriate comments, so I'll just acknowledge.
No, so first of all, thank you very much. We've received it. Mike and I have not yet been able to go through it in detail because we're still working through 300 pages. But the goal is that we want any and all comments. We'll review them in detail, and then we'll incorporate as much as we can. And if we have comments back, we'll definitely get in touch. Moving quickly on to Chapter 7, because again, 5 and 6 are on their way. So environmental protection, this deals with, wind, shadow, a lot of things like that. But the other thing too, we're just expanding the detail on, because we've gotten a lot of comments on this from both counselors as well too. But we'll be putting the beginning details of a construction management plan in. So we'll start to provide outlines of, here's how we approach road control, here's we trucking routes, dust, control, things like that. But this is just to give you a sense of how the plans will work. We'll come back with each phase with a detailed CMP plan that's its own separate book that will be reviewed by the city too as well. But that way people get a sense of, we are thinking about this from day one, and it'll continue to evolve. So that'll be actually in Chapter 7. So these are the forthcoming chapters. So transportation, again, transportation, and so these are some of the comments that we just got last time. People wanted to make sure these were going to be in here. The transportation is extremely detailed. It talks about existing conditions. It talks about proposed mitigation in detail. It talks about level of service of all the intersections that we're putting traffic through. And again, remember, we're studying over 53 intersections. So we are going far beyond even what the casino did. So it's very comprehensive. I'll give you a sense that, the MIPA one, we just put together is 170 pages by itself. And that is there's a whole appendix that's the full traffic study. This is just the upfront section. So very detailed. And we also do go through as well preliminary outline of the phasing of improvements. Again, for a big project like this, we have to have the ability to phase improvements in over time, but it will talk about roughly what improvements end up in what phases, which I think is going to be important. That'll be obviously a big discussion even as we continue beyond the submission, but just so you guys know, that's what's going to be in there.
You outlined in the first part of the transportation and traffic analysis kind of the scope of your studies and your aspirations about what can be done to mitigate effects, etc. I know we're going to be focused on this in 2 weeks, but have you run into any unexpected problems, obstacles, intractable issues beyond what you expected?
Well, I think our first observation is we knew a lot of the intersections were bad. I don't think we realized how bad they were. How's that? So I think a couple of things. We've had some very pleasant surprises that the upgrades on Route 1A work dramatically well. And when remember in the beginning of this, I talked about we're addressing existing conditions of queues, 3 million square feet of other development, background growth plus our growth. It works really well. And you'll see, we'll highlight the ones that, there'll definitely be a few intersections that are today level of service F. And despite all of our improvements and thoughts, they're still at a level of service of F, right? And so we're going to run into some of those intersections which, we're going to have to, knuckle down with the City of Revere as well as MassDOT to say, okay, well, good news is we just put all this development through, and we haven't made it much more worse, but F is not an improvement. F is just, there's just some things that just, what we also don't know yet is that, we don't know how, like we talked about before, the Route 16, Route 1 improvements, which could really draw traffic away from the Route 1A corridor. How does, like we're showing that, but some of these things we're going to have to evaluate over time as we go through it. One of the other things, too, we did not propose mitigation on yet is the City of Revere is working on its own mitigation program for a lot of intersections on, Ocean Avenue and Rare Beach Boulevard. So some of those don't show anything because, to be honest, we're being a bit differential, waiting for you guys to complete your study to come back to us. So that's probably the other nuance. Usually we don't like to leave anything that's an F unaddressed, but there are some things that you guys are already working on.
2 things I would say. Number one, we're fairly far along in that study, and I'm sure Jeff Dirk from Vaness will be glad to share his findings thus far. The second thing is, I would emphasize the importance of that first item, improving existing conditions. I think most people are approaching this project from the point of view, if you don't make a bad situation worse, you're doing something. I think the opportunity here is to make a bad situation better. And if that is true, and to the extent that that's true, I would really emphasize that aspect because it's a different way of looking at what the public benefits of this project would be.
So I think one other thing that you'll see also in the theme too is that the traffic study studies 2 years, 2028 and 2038, because it's a 20-year project. One of the things that's going to happen is that we actually look really great going through 2028, and we're actually probably overbuilding capacity to pick up the later phases of the project. Where it gets unknown is when we get to 2038, right? And one of the things we're going to be doing on an annual basis is doing traffic monitoring, because we think we have a very conservative traffic study in terms of the vehicles that are being generated. But why I say this too is it's such a long-term project. Part of this is going to be, well, let's get going on certain aspects. And we identify certain intersections where we say, we've even identified some improvements, but those improvements may not be necessary if we're not generating that amount of trips. And that's the other thing too, which is a struggle here. 20 years. So unlike a single project where we say, okay, yeah, we got 400 trips, I know exactly where it's going to go, and they're going to be here 2 years from today, we'll get to year 16 or 17, even like background growth. It's just, those are things we're going to have to kind of really work through. So, but there are definitely some material improvements. And then again, there's just some challenging conditions. There may also be conditions that are so far out of this area. It's like, Route 1, where Route 1 goes by Cappy's Liquors and the granite wall, right? 3 lanes to 2 lanes and opens up to 3 lanes. That's something the state probably should have done 35 years ago, and it's still there. Eventually we run into something like that where, regionally we're running into a regional issue that, but we identify those too as well so that the City of Revere can see them.
And to that point, and I guess when I look at this overall package that we're putting, the PUD that's being put together, and it's clearly defining what it is HYM is going to be doing to mitigate impacts, to build out the site, all the different things that are included in the overall project. It seems to me that one thing that's missing here, and it's not on you guys, but it's on, I think, the city of Revere, is to identify all the other types of projects that are going on that are working in concert with this to help mitigate the impact of it, or more importantly, the other things that still need to be done. Because as I keep pointing out, HYM can't do it alone. We need to make sure that we've got the city and the state delegation on board with understanding the importance of the things that need to be done in this city that may not be getting done, but are also getting done, and they need to be identified. You know, so that as people are looking at this project from an overall advertising awareness and maybe even PR, people say, hey, they're not doing this thing blind. But then we also understand what needs to be done, and then maybe there needs to be a side effort to go on, put pressure on the people that need to get the pressure to get them resolved.
Yeah, and I think, and obviously you guys are doing a pretty detailed analysis with Vanessa Associates right now, but this is probably the most comprehensive study of traffic conditions in this area in a very long time. So between what we're doing and what Vanessa's doing, it's going to give Revere a very clear picture of what's out there. And again, we might get to a few intersections, like you just said, Ed, where, you know, we're not putting much traffic through, we don't know how to handle, but you might say, okay, great, that's the next, you know, Revere thing we got to look at. And there might be 4 or 5 developments going on that might say, you know, you guys need to help us with this one or look at it. So I think the other thing too, we did at North Point too, you know, we saw it at North Point IQ bond financing through the state, you know, as well, which, you know, provided, you know, really significant funds to help us with, you know, the North Point side of the site, because there we actually reconstructed an entire mile of Monsignor O'Brien Highway. We're about to start that. So again, and the goal is to identify everything and then work with you guys to say, okay, here's what we can do. We're going to do all of this, but we're going to get to a point where the city or others are going to have to say, okay, but we need to do these things. Let's go find other sources of this, and we're willing to work on that.
I mean, I think the city completely agrees with that approach. I would also emphasize both Ed's point and yours. Solutions to some of these problems are actually fairly clear. We know what needs to be done on Route 1 North. We simply haven't had the critical mass of political will to get it done, because we are competing with Boston and others for priority expenditures and so forth. One of the things that we're hoping for, whether it was the casino in the old days or HYM today, is that adding your advocacy to that coalition of support will make all of the difference in the world. Paul Rupp has known what has to happen for Route 1 for 40 years, but now we may actually get it done with you.
Well, no, I think it's a really good point too. And again, we talked about this too, you know, there's obviously a very strong mentality in the state to fix what we have first, which is important, right? But there's important growth consequences for Revere if we don't go expand our opportunities. And again, we talked a lot about traffic, but this also has all the blue line analysis too as well. And so it's very important to note. So you're going to see blue line analysis as well in that. The great news for us is that there is material capacity in the blue line, which we are definitely utilizing. And for the most part, we're still within policy capacity for most of it. We do start to hit above policy capacity. And I don't know if you guys know, but there's 2 levels. There's a policy capacity and there's a crush capacity, which is above that. For example, the red line almost runs in crush capacity during all peak hours, right? The blue line today almost never crosses policy capacity, which is much lower. And even in a more aggressive transit mode share of 39%, we're only exceeding policy capacity in a very few peak hour segments. And so that's good news. We also evaluate the entire station platform's level of service. So with a more robust transit share and a more conservative transit share, and both stations from a platform capacity still work out really well. There are code and structural related elements that is different. And so again, we talked about this, we are still analyzing or studying the 2 stations, which the MBTA did for us. So those reports are still forthcoming. But it's not just vehicular centric, it is really a robust transportation study looking at all modes of travel. So you'll see that.
Obviously, roadway, transit, and so forth are important, but the other great asset we have, as was clear in the Amazon RFP response, is the proximity of the international airport. Do you deal with that connection, both its sort of regional benefits, but also its local burdens?
So just so you know, we have met, just like with everyone else, we've met with Massport probably now 4 times. particularly talking about improvements around Day Square and in the East Boston side, which they interact directly with. We've also talked with them specifically, which is just off here, but they own the land on the other side of us, which our culvert goes into. And so when we talk about climate change, on the other side, there's a tide gate that's crushed, which we just found out it's crushed. So, working with them on making sure the tide gate is operational because the pipes under the Route 1A are clogged and we want to clean them. We also don't want to have suddenly the Chelsea River come upstream. So minor details like that, but we have been working with them very closely. And then obviously because of the runway approaches too, we met with them very early on, just evaluating heights and things like that. So, so again, obviously Massport has its own mission, which is very important to the Commonwealth, but obviously we want to work with Revere and East Boston and ourselves to make sure it's a very collaborative process that works for everything. The improvements that we're showing, by the way, on Route 1A are a significant help to Massport as well too. Again, so because they're putting a lot of traffic through as well. Maybe too much Uber and Lyft traffic, but that's a different discussion. So phasing, again, you're just going to be expanding on it. We're also just going to be giving more detail on the interim uses because, again, we are a 52-acre site in Revere, and this is going to take 15 to 20 years, so we give a better sense of what we think some interim uses are going to be. Any interim use, we're going to work with the city of Revere on so they know about it. So some of you may know, like for on the Boston side, we did Cirque du Soleil. That was an interim use. We've done some other festivals within the, the infield type area or the racetrack. The goal is that we want to try to utilize the site as best as possible, but it's meant to enhance this site or the activity. It's not meant to be commuter parking for Logan Airport, and which, by the way, is not allowed by the SDOD anyways.
I was just going to mention that is not included among the possible.
Yes, just so we're clear. Yeah. So, but to give you a sense too, the city of Revere has asked us to assist with some, local staging at times for their water project on Winthrop Avenue. We helped out with some local staging. We've done some specific requests like that, but to be clear, we do very little of that because this is not meant to be an open session for anybody who wants to use it. It's really meant to be controlled, but the idea is that we do want to, look at stuff as we go forward. That helps the site.
And the city is grateful for that ability and also very cognizant of your intention to keep that to them.
The last chapter is municipal impacts. So again, we went through this pretty detailed in the presentation, so it's going to have a lot of that detail. And the last is, it's not just the city council, we talked about the executive summary. This will probably follow the preliminary submission, so we're going to probably submit the preliminary submission with everything. And then, Mike's got to sleep and see his family too as well. So then we'll follow up with the 30-page executive summary. But that'll be probably between the preliminary and the final, so you have both of those. And then the goal is then whatever comments or changes are made, then we submit the final back with a finalized executive summary, and then we go from there.
And Chapter 1 will be expanded to include all of the chapters yet to be completed municipal.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, and again, when I say this too, there may be additional detail here in these definitely, but there really should be no surprises compared to what we presented to you. There might be more refinement of it or more better detail of it, but we haven't, for example, we haven't changed the phasing, we haven't changed the square footage, we haven't changed the commercial mix. It's very consistent. It's a lot of information that we're putting into the PUD special permit.
Promise this is my last one. But going back to the public space and open network, and I'm sorry it didn't come up when we were talking about it. And I understand what you were saying before about the amphitheater being a fairly expensive piece to develop. And therefore, there's a phased approach to kind of developing that whole open space. Is there a way in which, the open space can be in sort of interim stages that allows people to kind of walk through the area, use walking spaces, or even bike through that area without having the amphitheater that it all can be developed at a later point in time and creates that, and tell me if it's not there already, but the connection between Beachmont Square and Belle Isle Square, for example?
So we are still thinking about interim connections and the ability to use some of the open area. I think we talked about this before. The issue that we have is that, and I don't want to scare anyone with this, but the site was filled, right? And it was filled with urban fill, right? So we have a requirement from a liability perspective is that we're actually going to be putting a clean cap of at least a 1 foot clean fill barrier on it. And again, no one should be worried about what's under the site. It's part of it's just partly unknown, right? We had to do this at North Point. We had to do 3 feet of clean fill. And the reason why at North Point was because we had a lead works factory there, a glass factory, a rail yard for 150 years. God knows what fell off the trains. And so what happens, we end up putting like a marker barrier down, and we put, 1 to 3 feet of clean fill. That would be really expensive for us to do that in that central common open space, right? So it makes it very difficult for us to do that without potentially creating liability for ourselves. It's best practices, so I don't want to, again, this is not a Superfund site. This is more just a typical practice now that happens. And we're actually lucky. We're only doing a 1-foot barrier because it's literally just urban fill. But with that said, as we start to get closer, we might end up getting really close between 2 phases, right? And the answer there is we might do an interim path, right? Or something that connects the 2 phases, right? I think that will flush out as we move forward with the development. So it's not, I mean, we would love tomorrow to literally open up the entire infield, but that does create risk for us and for people, to be honest, because, honestly, the site was filled 80 years ago. They just dropped soil on it. It's been growing grass, and so there's some best practices we need to implement. Yep.
If there are no other comments and questions, we may actually finish early. I would just close by saying our compliments on written materials that are very well written, very clear, very comprehensive. Obviously, they will be enhanced in ways that were based on our comments, but for a preliminary first draft, it is a very polished document, and so thank you very much.
So I want to say, since you're saying that, I want to thank Mike, Kate, Silmar, our consultant team, because to be honest, these guys are writing the bulk of it, right? I'm the one terrorizes them with reviewing it, but honestly, they've done a lot of incredible work. And to be honest, you guys have really helped this process too, because hopefully you're seeing what we've been hearing over the last, to be honest, 18 months. So, but thank you.
Very good. Seeing no more hands, we can adjourn. Thank you very much.